The snow falls silently on St. Petersburg as the year 1894 draws to a close. Within the Winter Palace, surrounded by rooms that stretch seemingly without end, a dying Tsar whispers his final words. Alexander III, the giant of a man who ruled Russia with an iron fist, is succumbing to kidney disease at the tragically young age of 49. His son, the young Nicholas, kneels beside him, utterly unprepared for what is about to fall upon his shoulders like an avalanche of snow from the palace rooftops. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov never wanted to be Tsar. At 26 years old, he stood just 5 feet 7 inches tall, with gentle eyes and a carefully groomed beard that would become his signature throughout history. He kept a meticulous diary, and on this November day, his entry was simple and devastating. My God, what a day! The Lord has called unto him our adored, our dear, our tenderly loved Papa. In those few words lay the seed of everything that would follow. The reluctant Tsar had inherited an empire that stretched across 11 time zones, encompassing 1/6 of the world's landmass, and containing over 100 million souls speaking dozens of languages. The Romanov dynasty, by 1894, had ruled Russia for nearly 300 years. They had transformed a medieval kingdom into a European power, had defeated Napoleon, had pushed Russian borders from the Baltic to the Pacific. The dynasty's founder, Michael Romanov, had been chosen in 1613 to restore order after the Time of Troubles, a period of such chaos and violence that it still haunted Russian memory centuries later. Since then, the Romanovs had given Russia some of its most memorable rulers. Peter the Great had built St. Petersburg on a swamp, dragging Russia into European politics. Catherine the Great had expanded the empire and brought Enlightenment ideals to her court. Alexander I had ridden into Paris after Napoleon's defeat. But the empire Nicholas inherited in 1894 was a paradox, a nation caught between past and future, traditional and modern, Eastern and Western. On the surface, Imperial Russia appeared magnificent. The Winter Palace alone contained over 1,500 rooms, its Baroque facades painted in distinctive mint green and white, its interior glittering with gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. The imperial family's wealth was almost incomprehensible. The Romanovs owned vast estates, palaces scattered across the empire, and a collection of jewels that included the largest sapphire in the world, and Easter eggs crafted by Fabergé that were themselves worth fortunes. Yet beneath this gilded surface, Russia simmered with tensions that would eventually tear it apart. The empire's economy remained primarily agricultural, with the vast majority of the population consisting of peasants who had only been freed from serfdom in 1861, just 33 years before Nicholas's accession. These peasants lived lives of grinding poverty that would have been recognizable to their medieval ancestors. They farmed using wooden plows, lived in one-room huts, and survived on a diet centered around black bread, cabbage, and potatoes. Many had never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace. They were illiterate, superstitious, and increasingly resentful of the vast inequality that separated their lives from those of the aristocracy. The aristocracy, meanwhile, lived in a world of almost unimaginable luxury. Grand balls in St. Petersburg might feature hundreds of guests, orchestras playing until dawn, champagne flowing from France, and tables laden with delicacies from across the empire and beyond. Noble families owned estates the size of small European countries, complete with hundreds or thousands of serfs who, even after emancipation, remained tied to the land in ways that limited their freedom. The aristocrats spoke French among themselves, considering Russian the language of servants. Many spent more time in Paris or Vienna than on their own estates. This disconnect between the ruling class and the masses would prove fatal. Nicholas himself was a product of this world. He had been educated by private tutors, had traveled extensively in Europe and Asia, and had served in the military as was traditional for Romanov heirs. He was deeply religious, believing sincerely in the Orthodox faith that had been intertwined with Russian identity for centuries. He believed in the concept of autocracy, the idea that the Tsar was God's appointed ruler, answerable to no earthly power. His father had reinforced this belief constantly, ruling without any concession to constitutional reform or democratic representation. But Nicholas lacked his father's physical presence and intimidating personality. Alexander III had been called the peacemaker partly because his sheer size and strength made conflict with him unthinkable. He could bend iron pokers with his bare hands and tear decks of cards in half. He had once held up the collapsing roof of a train car with his shoulders to save his family. Nicholas, by contrast, was slight, soft-spoken, and prone to moments of indecision that would plague him throughout his reign. He preferred domestic life to politics, loved his family deeply, and would have been far more happy as a country gentleman than as an autocratic emperor. As Nicholas stood by his father's deathbed that November day, the empire faced multiple crises that demanded decisive leadership. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Russia's cities, creating a new urban working class that lived in conditions even worse than the peasants they had left behind. Factory workers might labor 14 or 16 hours a day in dangerous conditions, living in barracks where dozens shared a single room. Revolutionary ideologies, from anarchism to Marxism, were spreading through underground networks despite the best efforts of the Okhrana, the feared secret police. The non-Russian peoples of the empire, from Poles in the west to Kazakhs in the east, from Finns in the north to Georgians in the south, increasingly chafed under Russian rule. Policies of Russification, which attempted to force Russian language and culture on these diverse populations, bred resentment and resistance. The empire's Jewish population faced particular persecution, confined to the Pale of Settlement and subject to periodic pogroms that the government did little to prevent and sometimes tacitly encouraged. The military, once the pride of the empire, had revealed serious weaknesses. The Crimean War of the 1850s had shown Russian forces to be poorly equipped and badly led compared to their European rivals. Reforms had been attempted, but progress was slow, hampered by conservative resistance and the sheer complexity of modernizing an army spread across such vast distances. As Nicholas took his oath as Tsar, all these problems awaited him. In just 23 years, his reign would end in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, in an explosion of gunfire that would kill him, his wife, his 5 children, and even the family doctor. The dynasty that had survived wars, revolutions, and palace coups for 3 centuries would be extinguished in a matter of minutes. The story of how this happened, how the mighty Romanovs fell from their pinnacle of power into the abyss, is a tale of personal tragedy, political miscalculation, military disaster, and ultimately, revolutionary violence that would reshape not just Russia, but the entire 20th century. The coronation of Nicholas II was planned as the greatest spectacle Russia had ever witnessed. The year was 1896, and Moscow, the ancient capital, prepared to receive its new Tsar with ceremonies that would link the young emperor to centuries of tradition. The Kremlin's golden domes gleamed in the May sunshine as nobles, foreign dignitaries, and church officials gathered for rituals that dated back to Byzantine times. But this celebration of imperial power would end in tragedy, a dark omen for the reign that was just beginning. Nicholas and his bride, Alexandra Fyodorovna, the former Princess Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, arrived in Moscow amid great fanfare. Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a shy and deeply religious woman who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy with genuine fervor. She was beautiful, with striking red-gold hair and gray-blue eyes, but her reserve was often misunderstood by the Russian court. She spoke Russian with a German accent that would later fuel accusations of disloyalty during World War I. From the beginning, the match was controversial. Alexandra's grandmother had opposed the marriage, sensing perhaps that Russia's throne was becoming dangerously unstable for her beloved granddaughter. The coronation ceremony itself took place in the Cathedral of the Assumption within the Kremlin on May 26th. The ritual was deeply Orthodox in character, emphasizing the sacred nature of the Tsar's authority. Nicholas, wearing the heavy imperial crown studded with nearly 5,000 diamonds, took up the orb and scepter, the symbols of his power over this vast empire. The crown weighed 9 pounds, a literal burden that Nicholas would carry throughout the ceremony. The air was thick with incense as the Metropolitan conducted the service in Old Church Slavonic, the ancient language of Russian Orthodoxy. Foreign observers noted the exotic, almost Eastern character of the proceedings, so different from the coronations they knew in Western Europe. After the religious ceremony, the celebrations continued for days. Balls were held in the Kremlin palaces, with the nobility appearing in their finest jewels and most elaborate costumes. The imperial family distributed commemorative medallions, enamel cups, and other gifts to mark the occasion. Foreign dignitaries presented their congratulations. Everything seemed to confirm the permanence and power of the Romanov dynasty. But the greatest celebration, the one intended for the common people of Moscow, was yet to come, and it would transform the coronation from triumph to tragedy in a matter of hours. The public celebration was scheduled for May 30th at Hodinka Field, a military training ground on the outskirts of Moscow. The authorities had planned an enormous festival for the people, with free food, drink, and commemorative gifts to be distributed to anyone who attended. Word spread through Moscow and the surrounding countryside that the Tsar would give each person a souvenir package containing a commemorative cup, some sweets, sausage, gingerbread, and a kerchief. For the poor of Moscow, many of whom struggled to feed their families, this was an irresistible attraction. The planning for the event was catastrophically inadequate. Hodinka Field was crisscrossed with trenches and holes from military exercises. The authorities constructed temporary wooden pavilions and booths, but they failed to anticipate the size of the crowd or to make adequate provisions for crowd control. The police presence was minimal, and the military units assigned to maintain order were insufficient and poorly positioned. The stage was set for disaster. On the evening of May 29th, people began gathering at Hodinka Field. By dawn on the 30th, the crowd had swelled to an estimated 500,000 people. Peasants had walked for days from surrounding villages. Workers from Moscow's factories had brought their families. All were pressed together in a massive crowd, waiting for the distribution of gifts to begin. Rumors began to circulate through the crowd that there would not be enough gifts for everyone, that only those who reached the distribution booths first would receive anything. These rumors, false but believed, transformed the crowd's mood from festive to anxious. At some point in the early morning, the crowd began to move. What started as a surge forward became a stampede. People pushed toward the distribution booths, desperate to ensure they would receive their commemorative packages. The trenches and holes in the field became death traps.
People fell and were trampled by those behind them who could not stop the forward momentum, even if they wanted to. The wooden structures collapsed under the pressure of bodies pushed against them. Screams filled the air as the realization spread that people were dying. The exact death toll would never fully be established. Official reports acknowledged over 1,300 deaths, with hundreds more injured. Unofficial estimates place the number much higher, perhaps as many as 2,000 dead. Bodies were piled in heaps, many crushed beyond recognition. The commemorative cups, which should have been symbols of celebration, were found clutched in the hands of the dead. The field that should have been the site of joyous celebration became instead a scene of horrific carnage, with blood soaking into the trampled earth. The imperial couple were not at the field when the disaster occurred. They learned of the tragedy hours later, after the bodies had been cleared away and hasty attempts made to restore order. Nicholas was devastated, writing in his diary of his horror and grief. He wanted to cancel all further coronation festivities immediately. But here, at this critical moment, Nicholas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and contribute significantly to his eventual downfall. His uncles and advisors, particularly Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, who was Governor General of Moscow, convinced Nicholas that canceling the scheduled events would be seen as weakness. That evening, a grand ball was scheduled at the French embassy. The advisors argued that failing to attend would insult France, Russia's crucial ally, and would suggest that the new Tsar was unable to handle the pressures of rule. Reluctantly, Nicholas agreed. That night, while families in Moscow mourned their dead, the Tsar and Tsarina attended the ball, going through the motions of celebration with forced smiles. This catastrophic error in public relations, though it reflected the isolation of the imperial court from popular sentiment, to the common people of Russia, it appeared that their Tsar cared more about diplomatic niceties and aristocratic parties than about the hundreds of his subjects who had been crushed to death. The fact that Nicholas and Alexandra were actually deeply distressed by the tragedy, that they visited the injured in hospitals and provided generous financial compensation to victims' families, mattered little compared to the powerful image of the Tsar dancing while his people lay dead. The Hodinka tragedy became known as the Hodinka disaster or Hodinka catastrophe in Russian history. For many, it was an omen, a sign that Nicholas's reign was cursed from the beginning. Revolutionary newspapers and underground publications made the most of it, using it to illustrate the government's incompetence and the Tsar's indifference to his people's suffering. The incident became part of revolutionary mythology, evidence that the autocratic system was fundamentally flawed and unable to protect even those who were loyal to it. That bond between Tsar and people, already weakened by decades of economic hardship and political repression, suffered a blow at Hodinka from which it would never fully recover.
For 8 years after their marriage, Nicholas and Alexandra faced a problem that became increasingly desperate with each passing year. The Empress gave birth to 4 daughters in succession: Olga in 1895, Tatiana in 1897, Maria in 1899, and Anastasia in 1901. Each birth was celebrated, but each also deepened the crisis. The Russian Empire required a male heir, someone who could continue the Romanov dynasty and provide stability for the future. The succession laws were clear and inflexible. Only a son could inherit the throne directly from Nicholas. Alexandra felt the pressure intensely. In the rigid world of royal dynasties, a queen's primary duty was to produce male heirs. With each daughter's birth,
Whispers spread through the court. Some suggested Nicholas should take a mistress, as his grandfather Alexander II had done, in hopes of producing a son. Others speculated that Nicholas might eventually need to divorce Alexandra and remarry, though this would create a scandal and crisis in Orthodox tradition. Alexandra, deeply in love with her husband and aware of her precarious position, became increasingly anxious and isolated. She turned more deeply to religion, spending hours in prayer, consulting holy men, and seeking any divine intervention that might grant her a son. Finally, on July 30th, 1904, Alexandra gave birth to a boy. The joy in the imperial family and throughout Russia was overwhelming. The child was named Alexei Nikolaevich, and his birth seemed to secure the dynasty's future. Gun salutes thundered across St. Petersburg, church bells rang throughout the empire, and Thanksgiving services were held in thousands of Orthodox churches. Nicholas wrote in his diary with unconcealed happiness, noting what a comfort it was to have a son after 4 daughters. For a brief moment, it seemed that fate was finally smiling on the young Tsar. But within weeks, Alexandra noticed something wrong. The infant Alexei bruised unusually easily. When he was circumcised, according to Orthodox tradition, the bleeding was difficult to stop. As he grew older and became more active, more alarming symptoms appeared. The slightest bump or fall would cause massive bruising. Sometimes bleeding would begin spontaneously inside his joints, causing excruciating pain and swelling. His knees, ankles, and elbows would swell to grotesque proportions, and the boy would scream in agony for hours or even days. The imperial doctors eventually confirmed what Alexandra had already begun to suspect. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, the royal disease that had spread through European royal families through Queen Victoria's descendants. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder in which the blood lacks certain proteins necessary for clotting. Even a minor injury can result in prolonged bleeding, and internal bleeding can occur spontaneously. In the early 20th century, there was no treatment. Children with severe hemophilia often died young, and those who survived faced a life of constant danger and recurring agony. For Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne, hemophilia meant that the simplest childhood activities became potentially fatal. A fall that would merely bruise a normal child could cause internal bleeding that might kill him. A bump to the head could result in a brain hemorrhage. Alexandra was devastated and consumed by guilt. Hemophilia is passed through the female line, though women themselves rarely suffer from it. Alexandra had inherited the gene from her grandmother, Queen Victoria, and had passed it to her son. She knew that her blood, the blood of the Hesse-Darmstadt lineage, had cursed the heir to the Russian throne. This knowledge intensified her religious fervor and drove her to even greater isolation. She became fiercely protective of Alexei, watching over him constantly, restricting his activities, and living in perpetual fear that the next episode of bleeding might be fatal. The imperial family made the fateful decision to keep Alexei's condition secret. They feared that if the Russian people knew the heir to the throne was gravely ill, it would destabilize the monarchy and encourage Nicholas's enemies. Only a small circle of family members, trusted servants, and doctors knew the truth. This secrecy would have profound consequences. It meant that many of the Empress's seemingly strange behaviors, her isolation, her mood swings, her obsessive protectiveness, made no sense to observers who did not know about Alexei's hemophilia. It also meant that when she found someone who seemed able to help her son, she would cling to that person with desperate intensity, regardless of what others thought or said. That person was Grigory Rasputin. Born in Siberia around 1869, Rasputin was a peasant who had gained a reputation as a holy man and healer. He was tall and powerful, with long, unkempt hair, a matted beard, and piercing eyes that many found mesmerizing. He claimed to have mystic powers and had gathered a following among some members of the St. Petersburg aristocracy, who were fascinated by his combination of peasant earthiness and spiritual charisma. Various accounts describe him as magnetic, crude, sexually voracious, and possessed of an uncanny ability to influence people. Rasputin was introduced to the imperial family in 1905 through a network of aristocratic connections. By 1906, he had demonstrated to Alexandra's satisfaction that he could help Alexei during his hemophilia attacks. The exact mechanism of Rasputin's apparent success remains debated by historians. Some believe he used hypnosis to calm the anxious child, reducing his blood pressure and thus limiting bleeding. Others suggest that the crises often resolved on their own, and Rasputin simply had the good fortune of being present when recovery was already beginning. Some modern medical historians have proposed that Rasputin, unlike the court doctors, may have instinctively understood that keeping Alexei calm and avoiding aspirin, which doctors of the era often prescribed and which worsens bleeding, would help the child. Whatever the explanation, Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin was a holy man sent by God to save her son. Several times when Alexei's life hung in the balance, when doctors had given up hope, Rasputin seemed to bring about improvement. In one famous incident in 1912, when Alexei suffered a severe bleeding episode while the family was at their Polish hunting lodge, the doctors believed the child was dying. Alexandra sent a desperate telegram to Rasputin, who was in Siberia. He telegraphed back with a message of reassurance, saying that the boy would live. Within a day, Alexei's condition began to improve. To Alexandra, this was proof of divine intervention. To her, Rasputin was a living saint, her son's savior, and anyone who opposed him was opposing God's will. Nicholas was more skeptical, but deferred to his wife on this matter, as on so many others. He saw that Rasputin seemed to help Alexei, and that Alexandra's faith in the holy man gave her comfort. The Tsar, who loved his wife deeply and suffered alongside her through each of Alexei's crises, was willing to tolerate Rasputin for the sake of his family's peace. This would prove to be a catastrophic misjudgment. Rasputin's presence at court became increasingly controversial. Rumors spread about his behavior, his drinking, his womanizing, and his crude manners. Whether all the stories were true remains unclear. Many were certainly exaggerated or fabricated by his enemies, but Rasputin did little to help his own reputation. He frequented taverns and bathhouses, he made crude sexual propositions to women who sought his blessing, and he boasted of his influence with the imperial family. Stories circulated of him seducing society women by claiming that sleeping with a holy man was a path to salvation. Tales of his drinking and carousing spread through St. Petersburg society and eventually into the broader public consciousness. For the revolutionaries and critics of the regime, Rasputin became a symbol of everything wrong with the autocracy. Here was an illiterate peasant who seemed to control the empress, and through her, the Tsar himself. The fact that he was from Siberia, that he was unwashed and crude, seemed to confirm the backwardness of the regime. Jokes and crude cartoons circulated depicting Rasputin as a puppet master manipulating the imperial family, or in even more explicit and offensive images suggesting a sexual relationship between Rasputin and Alexandra. These rumors were almost certainly false. Alexandra's devotion to Rasputin was
The morning of January 9th, 1905 dawned cold and clear in St. Petersburg.
Snow covered the broad avenues and squares of the imperial capital, and a sense of anticipation filled the air. Thousands of workers and their families were converging on the Winter Palace, led by a priest named Father Georgy Gapon. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar. They sang hymns and patriotic songs. They came in peace, they believed, to petition their father, the Tsar, to address their grievances and protect them from the abuses of factory owners and government officials. By the end of the day, the snow would be stained with blood, and the relationship between the Russian people and their Tsar would be fundamentally and irreparably changed. Father Gapon was a complex figure, part idealist, part opportunist, and possibly a police agent at various points in his career. He had organized an assembly of workers that was technically sanctioned by the authorities, one of several such organizations that the government tolerated or even encouraged as a way of channeling worker discontent into harmless directions. But the conditions in Russia's industrial cities had become so desperate that even these officially tolerated organizations were becoming radicalized. Workers typically labored 12 or more hours per day in dangerous factories. They lived in barracks where dozens might share a single room with no privacy or sanitation. Wages were barely sufficient for survival, and any protest was met with dismissal and blacklisting. In early January 1905, a labor dispute at the Putilov Works, St. Petersburg's largest factory, had escalated into a strike. The strike spread rapidly to other factories. Within days, over 100,000 workers had walked off their jobs. The city was paralyzed. Gapon, seeing an opportunity, organized a peaceful march to the Winter Palace to present a petition directly to the Tsar. The petition was remarkably moderate in its demands. It asked for an 8-hour workday, minimum wages, better working conditions, and some form of representation in government. It was written in language that emphasized the workers' loyalty to the Tsar and framed their suffering as the result of evil advisors and corrupt officials who had misled the emperor. Gapon sent word to the authorities about the planned march. He insisted it would be peaceful and that the marchers merely wanted to present their petition to the Tsar, whom they still viewed as their protector. But Nicholas was not in St. Petersburg. He had gone to his palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a few miles outside the city, partly because he was shaken by the strikes and the growing unrest. The authorities decided to prevent the marchers from reaching the Winter Palace. They positioned troops at key points throughout the city with orders to block the processions. On the morning of January 9th, multiple columns of marchers began moving toward the Winter Palace from different parts of the city. Estimates of the total number of participants range from 150,000 to 200,000 people. Entire families participated, with workers bringing their wives and children. Many were dressed in their best clothes out of respect for the Tsar they hoped to see. They carried religious icons, portraits of Nicholas II, and Russian flags. Witnesses described the scene as resembling a religious procession more than a political demonstration. The troops blocking the routes to the palace were nervous. Many were young conscripts, poorly trained and uncertain how to handle such a massive crowd. Their officers had given them contradictory instructions. Some units were told to disperse the crowd peacefully. Others were told to prevent the marchers from reaching the palace at any cost. There was no clear plan for how to manage a crowd of this size if it refused to disperse. At several locations throughout the city, the confrontation followed a similar pattern. The marchers reached a line of troops blocking their path. Gapone or other leaders would attempt to explain their peaceful intentions. Officers would order the crowd to disperse. The crowd, confused and unwilling to give up after coming so far, would continue to press forward. Then, without warning, the troops would open fire. The shooting began around 10 in the morning at the Narva Gate, where Gapone was leading one of the largest columns. Soldiers fired directly into the crowd at close range. People fell dead and wounded, their blood bright against the white snow. The marchers, who had expected to be received as loyal subjects, could not initially comprehend what was happening. Some thought the soldiers were firing blanks as a warning. Only when bodies began to pile up did panic set in. The crowd scattered, leaving behind the dead and wounded. Similar scenes played out at the Troitsky Bridge, in Palace Square, and at other locations throughout the city. The exact death toll from Bloody Sunday, as it immediately became known, has never been conclusively established. Official government figures claimed less than 100 deaths. Independent observers and opposition groups claimed over 1,000 deaths. The true number was probably between 300 and 1,000 deaths, with several thousand more wounded. But the precise number mattered less than the symbolic impact of the event. The Tsar's troops had fired on peaceful petitioners carrying the Tsar's own portrait and asking for his protection. The image of the Tsar as the father of his people, the orthodox monarch who cared for his subjects, was shattered beyond repair. News of Bloody Sunday spread rapidly throughout Russia and across the world. In the days and weeks that followed, strikes erupted in cities throughout the empire. Peasant uprisings broke out in the countryside. University students staged protests. Even some military units began to show signs of unreliability. The empire seemed to be spinning into chaos. What became known as the Revolution of 1905 had begun, and it would shake the Romanov dynasty to its foundations. Nicholas's response to the crisis revealed many of his weaknesses as a ruler. He issued a series of contradictory statements. At times, he seemed to acknowledge the legitimacy of some worker grievances. At other times, he blamed the unrest entirely on revolutionaries and foreign agitators. He met with workers' representatives, but seemed unable to grasp the depth of discontent or the need for fundamental reforms. He vacillated between conciliation and repression, satisfying neither reformers nor hardline conservatives. The revolution spread and intensified throughout 1905. In June, sailors on the battleship Potemkin mutinied in the Black Sea port of Odessa, an event that terrified the government since it suggested the military itself might no longer be reliable. Across the empire, people began forming Soviets, councils of workers that coordinated strikes and sometimes took over local administration. The St. Petersburg Soviet, led by a young revolutionary named Leon Trotsky, became particularly powerful and bold. Peasants seized land from landlords and burned manor houses. Non-Russian peoples demanded autonomy or independence. The empire seemed to be coming apart. Facing this unprecedented crisis, Nicholas's advisors were divided. Hardliners wanted massive repression to crush the revolution through force. Reformers argued that only political concessions could stabilize the situation. Nicholas, caught between these factions and uncertain of his own course, finally yielded to the advice of his more liberal ministers. On October 17, 1905, he issued what became known as the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto promised civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and association. Most significantly, it promised the creation of an elected legislature, the Duma, with real legislative.
The First Duma convened in the Grand Tauride Palace in St. Petersburg on April 27, 1906. The setting was magnificent, with classical columns and ornate decorations intended to impress the new deputies with the dignity of their office. Representatives from across the vast empire gathered, many wearing traditional costumes from their regions, speaking dozens of languages, representing constituencies that had never before had any voice in national politics. It should have been a historic moment of reconciliation between the Tsar and his people, the beginning of Russia's transformation into a constitutional monarchy. Instead, it marked the beginning of 11 years of political dysfunction that would end with the dynasty's destruction. From the very start, the relationship between Nicholas II and the Duma was poisoned by mutual suspicion and resentment. Nicholas had granted the October Manifesto under duress, and he regretted it almost immediately. He believed in autocracy not merely as a political system, but as a sacred trust from God. In his view, limiting the Tsar's power was not just politically unwise, but spiritually wrong. It betrayed the trust placed in him by his ancestors and by God himself. He referred to the Duma in his private correspondence as that institution, and looked for ways to minimize its power and influence. Nicholas's chief instrument in neutering the Duma was the fundamental laws, issued just days before the First Duma convened. These laws, which Nicholas promulgated on his own authority, significantly limited the Duma's powers. The Tsar retained control over foreign policy, the military, and much of the budget. He could issue emergency decrees when the Duma was not in session, and these decrees had the force of law. Most importantly, Article 87 allowed the Tsar to rule by decree during emergencies. The fundamental laws transformed the promise of the October Manifesto. Russia would have a parliament, but it would be a parliament with sharply limited powers, operating within a system that remained fundamentally autocratic. The composition of the First Duma reflected the deep discontent in Russian society. The largest block of deputies came from the Constitutional Democratic Party, known as the Cadets, who wanted Russia to become a genuine constitutional monarchy along British lines. There were also significant numbers of labor group deputies, representing workers and peasants, along with representatives of various national minorities. The most radical parties, including the Bolsheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, had boycotted the elections, believing that participation would legitimize a system they wanted to overthrow. This boycott inadvertently made the First Duma more moderate than Russian society as a whole, but it was still far too radical for Nicholas's comfort. The First Duma immediately came into conflict with the government. The deputies, many of whom had been elected on platforms promising radical land reform and expanded civil liberties, began drafting legislation to fulfill these promises. They demanded amnesty for political prisoners, abolition of the death penalty, and expropriation of large estates to give land to peasants. They criticized the government's handling of continuing unrest and called for ministers to be responsible to the Duma rather than to the Tsar alone. In essence, they were demanding that Russia become a genuine parliamentary democracy.
The government, led by ministers appointed by and responsible only to the Tsar, refused to accept the Duma's demands. Nicholas's chief minister during this period was Peter Stolypin, a capable and determined conservative reformer who wanted to modernize Russia while preserving the autocracy. Stolypin viewed the First Duma as impossibly radical and unworkable. After just 72 days, on July 8, 1906, Nicholas dissolved the First Duma. Troops surrounded the Tauride Palace, and the deputies were sent home. The dissolution of the First Duma prompted some deputies to issue the Vyborg Manifesto, calling on Russians to refuse to pay taxes or provide recruits to the military until the Duma was restored. The manifesto had little practical effect, but it resulted in the deputies who signed it being barred from future participation in politics. This removed some of the most talented and moderate reformers from the political scene, a loss Russia could ill afford. Elections for the Second Duma were held in early 1907. This time, the radical parties decided to participate, which resulted in a Duma even more hostile to the government than the first. The Second Duma included significant numbers of socialist revolutionaries and social democrats, including both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. These deputies had no interest in making the constitutional system work. They used the Duma primarily as a platform for revolutionary propaganda, making inflammatory speeches that were reported in newspapers and circulated in pamphlets. The Second Duma lasted only from February to June 1907, just 103 days. The breaking point came when Stolypin demanded that the Duma allow prosecution of social democratic deputies for allegedly plotting to incite rebellion in the army. When the Duma refused, Nicholas dissolved it and simultaneously, in clear violation of the fundamental laws, changed the electoral law to ensure that future Dumas would be more conservative. The new electoral law of June 1907 dramatically reduced the voting power of workers, peasants, and non-Russian peoples, while increasing the representation of wealthy landowners and ethnic Russians. The change was blatantly illegal according to the fundamental laws, which stated that the electoral system could not be changed without the Duma's consent. But Nicholas and Stolypin calculated, correctly, that there would be no serious resistance to this coup. Revolutionary energy had been exhausted by the failed revolution of 1905 and the brutal repression that followed. The population was weary, and the regime's willingness to use force was clear. The Third Duma, elected under the new rules, was far more conservative and proved to be the most successful of the four Dumas that would meet before the revolution. It served its full 5-year term from 1907 to 1912, working in relative cooperation with Stolypin's government. The Third Duma passed important legislation on military reform, education, and local government. It also approved Stolypin's agrarian reforms that aimed to create a class of prosperous peasant landowners who would have a stake in preserving the existing order. Stolypin's agrarian reforms were based on the idea that Russia's fundamental problem was the peasant commune, the traditional village organization in which land was held collectively and periodically redistributed among families. Stolypin believed that as long as peasants could not own their land individually, they would never develop the initiative and productivity necessary for a modern agricultural economy. His reforms allowed and encouraged peasants to consolidate their scattered strips into single farms and to withdraw from the commune to become individual proprietors. The reforms had mixed results. Some peasants, particularly the more enterprising ones, did consolidate their holdings and became more prosperous. But the reforms were deeply unpopular with many peasants who valued the security provided by the commune. They also created social tensions in villages, dividing communities between those who accepted the reforms and those who resisted them. Stolypin famously said that the reforms needed 20 years of peace to succeed. He would not get that time, and neither would Russia. In September 1911, Stolypin was assassinated at the Kiev Opera House in the presence of the Tsar. The assassin was Dmitry Bogrov, who was both a revolutionary and a police informer, operating in the murky world where revolutionary conspiracy and police provocation overlapped. The assassination removed one of the most capable statesmen Russia possessed at a time when capable leadership was desperately needed. Nicholas, who had never entirely trusted Stolypin and had resented his strong personality and independent judgment, did not replace him with anyone of comparable ability. The Fourth Duma, elected in 1912, was similar in composition to the Third. It continued the pattern of limited cooperation between government and legislature, but the relationship was never smooth. Deputies complained that their legislative work was constantly undermined by the government use of Article 87 to issue emergency decrees. The government complained that even this conservative Duma was too critical and interfering. Neither side trusted the other, and neither side was committed to making the constitutional system work. The fundamental problem was that Nicholas never accepted the legitimacy of constitutional limitations on his power. He viewed the Duma as at best a consultative body that he could ignore when convenient and dissolve when it became troublesome. He refused to appoint ministers who had the confidence of the Duma, insisting that ministers were responsible to him alone. This meant that there was no way for the Duma to influence policy except through persuasion, and persuasion had little effect on a government that did not respect.
The summer of 1914 began with an air of optimism in St. Petersburg society. The season's balls and parties were particularly brilliant. The empire seemed stable after years of turmoil. The economy was growing rapidly, with industrial production increasing and peasant agriculture, stimulated by Stolypin's reforms, becoming more productive. Russia's international position seemed secure, backed by its alliance with France and its improving relationship with Britain. The Tsar and his family were at their summer retreat in the Finnish fjords, enjoying the peaceful Baltic waters and the simple pleasures of family life that Nicholas cherished above all else. Then, on June 28th, news arrived that Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary had been assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. The event seemed tragic but distant, a Balkan affair that need not concern the great powers unduly. Europe had weathered many such crises before. Diplomats would talk, compromises would be reached, and the incident would fade into history. No one in that beautiful summer could imagine that this assassination would unleash a catastrophe that would kill millions and destroy 4 empires, including the Russian Empire itself. The crisis escalated with terrible speed. Austria-Hungary, with German backing, issued an ultimatum to Serbia that was designed to be unacceptable. Serbia, counting on Russian support, rejected the most extreme demands. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th. The alliance systems that were supposed to keep the peace through deterrence instead became mechanisms for transforming a regional conflict into a continental war. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and determined not to back down as it had in previous crises, began to mobilize its forces. Nicholas agonized over the decision to mobilize. He knew that mobilization might make war inevitable. He exchanged increasingly desperate telegrams with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, each addressing the other as Willie and Nicky, trying to find a way to step back from the brink. But the military machines of Europe, once set in motion, were difficult to stop. Russia's military plans called for mobilization against both Austria-Hungary and Germany simultaneously. When Germany demanded that Russia cease mobilization and Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. The outbreak of war produced an extraordinary wave of patriotic enthusiasm in Russia. In St. Petersburg, crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace, singing the imperial anthem and demanding to see the Tsar.
Nicholas appeared on the balcony with his family, and the crowd fell to its knees in a spontaneous gesture of loyalty and devotion. Similar scenes occurred in Moscow and other cities. Political differences seemed to evaporate in the face of external threat. The Duma voted war credits with only minimal opposition. Even some revolutionary groups called for support of the war effort until victory was achieved. St. Petersburg was immediately renamed Petrograd because the original name sounded too German. Anything associated with Germany became suspect. German-owned shops were attacked and looted. German residents, including many whose families had lived in Russia for generations, faced harassment and persecution. The fact that the Empress Alexandra was of German birth became an increasing problem. Despite her genuine devotion to her adopted country and her conversion to Orthodoxy, many Russians never fully trusted her, and now began to see her as potentially disloyal. The initial military operations seemed to confirm the patriotic optimism. Russian armies invaded East Prussia in August 1914, advancing more rapidly than the Germans had expected. This offensive, launched before Russia's mobilization was complete, was designed to relieve pressure on France, which was reeling from the German assault through Belgium. The Russian advance caused panic in Germany and forced the Germans to transfer troops from the Western Front to the east, contributing to their failure to capture Paris. But the Russian offensive in East Prussia ended in catastrophe. At the Battle of Tannenberg in late August, the German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff encircled and destroyed the Russian Second Army. An entire army of over 90,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The army's commander, General Alexander Samsonov, killed himself in the forest rather than face the shame of defeat. A few days later, at the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, the Russian First Army was also defeated and forced to retreat from East Prussia. These defeats revealed serious problems in the Russian military that would plague it throughout the war. Russian generals were often poorly trained and inflexible in their thinking, unable to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. Communication between headquarters and frontline units was poor, with messages sometimes taking days to arrive. The Russian army lacked sufficient modern equipment, particularly heavy artillery, machine guns, and even rifles. While Russian soldiers showed tremendous courage and endurance, they were often sent into battle inadequately armed and supplied. This wasn't a universal situation, but it occurred often enough to be deeply demoralizing. Soldiers began to question whether their lives were being thrown away needlessly, whether the generals and the government understood or cared about their situation. The Russian railway system, which had never been adequate for the empire's vast size, was completely overwhelmed by the demands of war. Supplies accumulated at rail depots because there weren't enough engines or cars to move them forward. The army competed with civilians for rail transport, and neither got enough. The situation would grow progressively worse as the war continued, eventually contributing to the collapse of the entire supply system. In the spring of 1915, Germany shifted its focus to the Eastern Front, determined to knock Russia out of the war. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians launched a massive offensive in Galicia, supported by overwhelming artillery firepower that Russian forces could not match. Russian armies, short of ammunition and unable to withstand the bombardment, were forced to retreat. The retreat quickly became a rout. Through the summer of 1915, Russian forces fell back hundreds of miles, abandoning Poland, Lithuania, and much of Latvia. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Great Retreat of 1915, as it became known, was accompanied by a refugee crisis of unprecedented scale. As Russian armies retreated, they implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying crops and buildings to deny them to the Germans. Millions of civilians fled eastward, clogging the roads and railway lines, spreading disease and despair. The scenes were apocalyptic. Endless columns of refugees trudging through mud and rain, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, often starving and sick, with no clear destination or hope of return. Nicholas, watching his armies retreat and his people suffer, made a decision that would have profound consequences. In August 1915, he dismissed his uncle, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, as commander-in-chief of the Russian armies and assumed personal command himself. Nicholas believed that his presence at the front would inspire the troops and that he needed to take direct responsibility for the war effort. His ministers and advisors almost unanimously opposed this decision, pointing out that he had no military experience in command and that taking personal command would make him personally responsible for any future defeats. But Nicholas, in one of his rare moments of decisive action, refused to be dissuaded. He left Petrograd for the Stavka, the army headquarters located in the town of Mogilev in Belarus, and he would remain there for much of the rest of the war, hundreds of miles from the capital, while Alexandra remained behind, increasingly isolated and increasingly under the influence of Rasputin. The stage was set for a political crisis that would, within 18 months, bring down the dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. While Nicholas commanded his armies from the distant headquarters at Mogilev, life in Petrograd and other Russian cities was deteriorating with alarming speed. The war that had begun with such patriotic enthusiasm in 1914 was by 1916 grinding down the empire's economy, straining its social fabric, and exhausting its people's patience. The home front, which in modern warfare is as crucial as the military front, was collapsing, and with it, the last foundations of support for the Romanov dynasty. The economic impact of the war was catastrophic. Russia had entered the war with an economy that, while growing rapidly, was still primarily agricultural and unable to meet the demands of modern industrial warfare. The German occupation of Poland and the western provinces had cost Russia some of its most important industrial regions. Millions of men had been drafted into the army, removing them from productive labor in factories and farms. The railway system was devoted almost entirely to military traffic, disrupting the normal flow of goods and raw materials. By 1916, Russian cities were experiencing severe shortages of basic necessities. Food supplies were irregular and inadequate. It was not that Russia lacked food. The empire's agricultural production actually remained reasonably strong. But the transportation system could not move food from the countryside to the cities. Peasants facing inflation that made paper money nearly worthless were increasingly unwilling to sell their produce for currency that would buy them nothing. They hoarded grain or consumed it themselves, feeding it to livestock rather than selling it for money that lost value by the day. The breadlines in Petrograd grew longer and longer. Women would stand for hours in the freezing cold waiting for shops to open, hoping to buy bread at controlled prices before supplies ran out. Often they waited in vain. Shops would open with signs announcing no bread, no flour, no sugar, no meat. The queues themselves became centers of discontent, places where women shared their grievances and their growing anger at a government that seemed incapable of feeding its own people. Inflation was destroying the value of money and the economic security of millions. Workers' wages, even when they increased in nominal terms, could not keep pace with the rising cost of living. A worker who had been able to support his family adequately in 1914 found himself unable to afford basic necessities by 1916. The middle classes, living on fixed incomes or salaries that did not adjust quickly to inflation,
saw their savings evaporate and their standard of living plummet. Even the wealthy faced difficulties as luxuries disappeared and basic goods became expensive and hard to obtain. The industrial working class, which had grown dramatically in the years before the war, became increasingly militant and revolutionary. Strikes, which had been relatively rare in the first years of the war, became more frequent and more political in character. Workers were no longer just demanding higher wages, they were demanding peace, bread, and often the overthrow of the government. The factories of Petrograd, concentrated in a few industrial districts, became centers of revolutionary organization and propaganda. The city's location, the same one that Peter the Great had chosen to serve as Russia's window to Europe, now worked against the government. Petrograd was far from Russia's agricultural heartland, dependent on long and vulnerable supply lines that the deteriorating rail system could not maintain. The government's response to these crises was characterized by incompetence, corruption, and frequent changes in personnel. Ministers came and went with bewildering rapidity. In the last 17 months of the monarchy, Russia had 4 different prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 4 ministers of agriculture, and 3 ministers of war. This ministerial leapfrog, as it was called, made coherent policy impossible and convinced many that the government had lost all capacity for effective action. Much of the blame for this ministerial chaos was directed at Alexandra. With Nicholas at the Stavka, Alexandra had assumed a more active role in government affairs. She bombarded her husband with letters, sometimes writing multiple times per day, advising him on appointments and policies. She viewed herself as protecting his autocratic powers from ministers and Duma deputies who wanted to limit them. But her judgment was clouded by her reliance on Rasputin, whom she consulted on virtually every important decision. Rasputin's influence on appointments was often decisive. He would recommend or oppose candidates for ministerial posts, and Alexandra would relay these recommendations to Nicholas, often in language suggesting they came directly from God. Nicholas, devoted to his wife and reluctant to contradict her advice, often followed her advice even when it contradicted the recommendations of more knowledgeable advisors. The result was that competent ministers were sometimes dismissed and replaced with mediocrities whose primary qualification was Rasputin's approval. The most notorious example was Boris Sturmer, whom Nicholas appointed as prime minister in February 1916. Sturmer was elderly, incompetent, and had a German surname that fueled suspicions of disloyalty. His appointment was widely viewed as evidence that the government was controlled by the dark forces surrounding Alexandra and Rasputin. Even conservative and monarchist politicians were appalled. When Sturmer attempted to negotiate a separate peace with Germany later in 1916, the scandal forced his dismissal, but the damage to the monarchy's credibility was already done. The Duma, which had loyally supported the war effort in 1914, became increasingly critical of the government. In August 1915, various moderate parties in the Duma had formed the Progressive Bloc, which demanded a government that had the confidence of the nation and would prosecute the war more effectively. The Duma deputies were not revolutionaries. Most were monarchists who wanted to save the monarchy from itself. But Nicholas and Alexandra viewed any limitation on autocratic power as unacceptable. They rejected the Progressive Bloc's demands and prorogued the Duma to silence its criticisms. By late 1916, even conservative supporters of the monarchy were losing faith. Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, a cousin of the Tsar and a respected historian,
wrote to Nicholas warning him that the dynasty was in mortal danger and that Alexandra and Rasputin were destroying it. Other Grand Dukes sent similar warnings. Family members pleaded with Nicholas to send Alexandra away from Petrograd or at least to remove Rasputin from the scene. Nicholas rejected all such advice, seeing it as disloyal interference in his family life and an attempt to undermine his authority. Rasputin himself was at the height of his influence, and his behavior was more scandalous than ever. He spent his nights drinking in restaurants and bathhouses, boasting of his power over the imperial family and making crude sexual advances to women. Police reports on his activities, which were dutifully filed but apparently never reached the Tsar, documented a pattern of behavior that would have discredited any public figure. Rumors circulated, many exaggerated or fabricated, but widely believed about Rasputin's debauchery and his control over the Empress. These rumors were almost certainly false, but they were widely believed, and belief was what mattered politically. In the trenches, meanwhile, Russian soldiers continued to fight and die in numbers that defied comprehension. Russian casualties by the end of 1916 totaled approximately 6 million killed, wounded, or captured. Entire regiments had been wiped out and reconstituted multiple times. The survivors were increasingly war-weary and demoralized. They had initially fought with enthusiasm, believing in the cause in the Tsar, but 3 years of inadequate supplies, incompetent leadership, and senseless slaughter had eroded that enthusiasm. Soldiers began to question why they were fighting, what they were dying for, and whether their officers in the government cared about them at all. Discipline in the army was deteriorating. Desertion rates were climbing. Soldiers who returned from the front to the rear areas brought tales of suffering and mismanagement that spread.
The night of December 16th, 1916, was bitterly cold in Petrograd. Snow lay thick in the streets, and the winter darkness seemed to deepen the sense of foreboding that had settled over the capital. In the Yusupov Palace on the Moika Canal, one of the most beautiful private residences in the city, a group of conspirators waited nervously for their victim to arrive. They were not revolutionaries or terrorists. They were members of the Russian elite who believed they were acting to save the monarchy from the man they saw as its greatest enemy, Grigory Rasputin. Prince Felix Yusupov was the organizer and leader of the conspiracy. At 29 years old, he was fabulously wealthy, married to the Tsar's niece, and cultivated an appearance of aesthetic refinement that bordered on decadence. He was also deeply concerned about the monarchy's survival and convinced that Rasputin was leading it to destruction. The other conspirators included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar and one of the most eligible bachelors in Russian society, Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing member of the Duma, known for his passionate speeches denouncing Rasputin, an army officer named Suhotin, and Dr. Stanislaus Lazovert, who had been recruited to provide the poison. The plan was to lure Rasputin to Yusupov's palace with the promise of meeting Yusupov's beautiful wife, Irina, whom Rasputin had expressed interest in meeting. In fact, Irina was not in Petrograd, but the conspirators counted on Rasputin's vanity and his reputation for seeking sexual encounters with society women to make him accept the invitation. They had prepared cyanide poison, which they planned to put in cakes and wine.
After Rasputin consumed the poison and died, they would dispose of his body in the frozen Neva River, making it appear that he had been killed by revolutionaries or foreign agents. Rasputin arrived at the palace around midnight, dressed in his finest embroidered shirt and velvet trousers, his beard carefully combed. Yusupov led him to a basement room that had been decorated to appear comfortable and intimate, with a fire burning in the fireplace and a table set with cakes and wine. While they waited for Irina to arrive from a party upstairs, Yusupov invited Rasputin to eat and drink. The other conspirators waited above, playing gramophone records to simulate the sounds of a party. Rasputin ate the cakes and drank the wine, all of which had been liberally laced with cyanide. He showed no ill effects. The conspirators had obtained the poison from Dr. Lazovert, who claimed it was enough to kill several men almost instantly. But Rasputin continued to eat and drink, talking expansively, showing not even the slightest sign of illness. Whether the poison was defective, whether it had degraded over time, or whether Rasputin's body had some unusual resistance has never been fully explained. After more than 2 hours, Rasputin was still alive and becoming impatient about meeting Irina. Yusupov, desperate and panicked, went upstairs to consult with his fellow conspirators. They decided that since poison had failed, they would have to shoot Rasputin. Grand Duke Dmitry gave Yusupov his revolver, and Yusupov returned to the basement. He invited Rasputin to look at an ornate crucifix on a cabinet, and as Rasputin examined it, Yusupov shot him in the chest at close range. Rasputin collapsed, and Yusupov rushed upstairs to tell the others that it was done. The conspirators came down to examine the body. Dr. Lazovert pronounced Rasputin dead. But as they were discussing how to dispose of the corpse, Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened. He lunged at Yusupov, grabbing him by the throat and tearing an epaulet from his shoulder. The conspirators scattered in terror. Rasputin, despite his wound, somehow managed to rise and stagger up the stairs and out into the courtyard, heading for the gate and the street beyond. Purishkevich, recovering from his initial shock, ran after Rasputin and shot him twice more in the courtyard. Rasputin finally fell in the snow. The conspirators dragged him back inside, but they were convinced he was still not quite dead. In a frenzy of fear and rage, they beat him with a rubber club and, according to some accounts, castrated him, though this detail is disputed. Finally, certain that he was dead, they wrapped the body in a curtain, drove to a bridge over the Neva River, and threw it through a hole in the ice. When Rasputin's body was recovered several days later, the autopsy revealed water in his lungs, suggesting that he may have still been alive when thrown into the river, and that he drowned beneath the ice. The resilience Rasputin showed, surviving poison and gunshot wounds, contributed to the legend that he was supernatural or possessed of mystical powers. In reality, the cyanide had probably degraded or been improperly prepared, and the first gunshot, while serious, had missed vital organs. But the legend of Rasputin's seemingly impossible resistance to death added to his mystique even in death. The conspirators made little effort to hide their involvement. They believed they would be hailed as heroes who had saved Russia from a malign influence. To some extent, they were right. When news of Rasputin's death spread through Petrograd society, many people openly celebrated.
The Duma was euphoric. Even some members of the imperial family were relieved. Letters and telegrams poured in to the conspirators, congratulating them and expressing gratitude. But Alexandra was devastated. She had lost the man she believed could save her son, the holy man who had been sent by God to protect her family. She demanded severe punishment for the murderers. Nicholas, returning from the Stavka, was caught between his wife's demand for vengeance and the political reality that most of the elite supported the conspirators. He eventually exiled Yusupov to his estates and sent Grand Duke Dmitry to military service in Persia, punishments that were remarkably lenient, given that they had murdered one of the imperial family's closest associates. Rasputin was buried in the grounds of the imperial palace at Tsarskoye Selo, with Alexandra and her daughters attending the funeral. It was a mark of how isolated the imperial family had become that they would bury this controversial figure in ground reserved for royalty. The burial location would prove significant a few months later, when, after the revolution, a mob would dig up the coffin and burn Rasputin's remains on a bonfire. A final symbolic rejection of the man who had so dominated the final years of the dynasty. The conspirators had believed that removing Rasputin would save the monarchy by removing its greatest liability. They were tragically wrong. Rasputin's murder, rather than stabilizing the situation, actually made it worse in several ways. First, it demonstrated that the monarchy was so weak that members of the imperial family and the high aristocracy felt they could murder one of the Tsar's associates with impunity. Second, it showed that the Tsar and the Tsarina were so isolated that they could not even protect their own friend. And third, it removed one of the few people who sometimes counseled moderation, as Rasputin, despite his many flaws, had occasionally advised Alexandra against overly harsh measures. Most importantly, Rasputin's death did nothing to address the real problems facing Russia. The cities were still hungry, the railways were still failing, the army was still demoralized, the government was still incompetent, the war was still grinding on with no end in sight. Removing Rasputin was like removing a symptom while leaving the disease untreated. The conspirators had convinced themselves that Rasputin was the cause of Russia's problems, when in reality, he was merely a very visible symptom of the autocracy's dysfunction. In the 2 months between Rasputin's death and the revolution,
February 1917 in Petrograd began much like the previous winter months, cold, dark, and marked by growing desperation. The bread lines grew longer each day. Women stood in the freezing cold for hours, often leaving empty-handed. The trains that should have brought food into the city were delayed or diverted to military use. Coal for heating was scarce. The factories were restless with strikes and work stoppages. Yet there was no sense that this particular February would be different from any other, that within days the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty would collapse with astonishing suddenness. February 23rd, according to the Russian calendar, which Russia still used, was International Women's Day. Women textile workers in the Vyborg district, one of Petrograd's main industrial areas, walked off their jobs to protest bread shortages. They marched through the streets, calling on workers in other factories to join them. This was not particularly unusual. Strikes had become common. But this time, the protest gained momentum. Workers in metal factories joined the textile workers. By the end of the day, more than 50,000 workers were on strike in Petrograd. The next day, February 24th, the strike expanded dramatically. Over 150,000 workers were now off their jobs. The demonstrations took on a more explicitly political character. Alongside demands for bread, marchers began shouting, "Down with the autocracy," and "Down with the war." The crowds were not attacking soldiers or police systematically. There was still a carnival-like atmosphere to some of the demonstrations, with workers feeling their power as their numbers swelled. On February 25th, the strike became a general strike. Nearly the entire workforce of Petrograd, some 300,000 workers, was on the streets. The city was paralyzed. Shops closed, newspapers stopped printing, public transportation ceased. The crowds now filled the center of the city, marching toward the Winter Palace and the government buildings, demanding bread, peace, and political change. The police tried to disperse the demonstrations, but they were vastly outnumbered. Nicholas, at his headquarters in Mogilev, seemed remarkably unconcerned. He received reports of the disturbances, but appeared to believe they were merely another outbreak of unrest that would be suppressed like previous ones. He sent a telegram to General Habalov, the military commander in Petrograd, ordering him to suppress the disorders immediately. This command set in motion a tragedy that would destroy what remained of the Tsar's authority. On February 26th, Sunday, troops were ordered to fire on demonstrators. At several locations throughout the city, soldiers opened fire on crowds of workers, killing and wounding dozens. The most infamous incident occurred on Nevsky Prospect, Petrograd's main boulevard, where soldiers of the Volhynian Regiment fired into a crowd, killing more than 50 people. The bloodshed marked a critical turning point. The initial protests over bread had been transformed into something far more serious by the government's violent response. That night, soldiers in their barracks began to discuss what they had been ordered to do. They had fired on unarmed Russian civilians, on workers and their families, people much like their own families in villages and towns across the empire. Many of these soldiers were recent conscripts from peasant families. They had not volunteered to shoot Russian workers in the streets of the capital. In the Volhynian Regiment's barracks, a sergeant named Kirpichnikov argued that they should refuse any further orders to fire on the crowds. His arguments found a receptive audience among soldiers who were already horrified by what they had done. The morning of February 27th brought the decisive shift. When officers tried to form up the Volhynian Regiment to march out against the demonstrators, the soldiers refused orders. Some accounts say they shot their commanding officer. They then marched out not to suppress the demonstrations, but to join them. The mutiny spread with stunning speed. The Preobrazhensky Regiment, the oldest and most prestigious unit in the Russian army, founded by Peter the Great himself, mutinied and joined the revolution. The Lithuanian Regiment followed. Within hours, the entire Petrograd garrison, over 150,000 soldiers, had either mutinied or remained neutral in their barracks. Armed soldiers now joined the workers in the streets. Crowds attacked police stations and government buildings. They stormed the arsenal and seized thousands of rifles, distributing them to workers. Prisoners were freed from the city's prisons. The Peter and Paul fortress, the grim prison where generations of political prisoners had been held, was seized by revolutionary forces. The Winter Palace was evacuated, with the ministers fleeing. By nightfall on February 27th, Petrograd was in the hands of the revolution. The Duma, which Nicholas had prorogued a few days earlier in response to its criticism of the government, reconvened in emergency session. The deputies faced an unprecedented situation. The government had collapsed. The city was in chaos. Mutinous soldiers and revolutionary workers were in control of the streets.
The Duma deputies, most of whom were moderate conservatives or liberals, had not sought revolution, but revolution had come and they had to respond. The Duma formed a provisional committee and began trying to establish some kind of order. At the same time, representatives of the socialist parties and the workers began forming Soviets, councils modeled on those from the 1905 revolution. The Soviet met in the Tsar Palace in a different wing from where the Duma was meeting. These two bodies, representing different constituencies and different visions for Russia's future, would attempt to govern together in an arrangement that became known as dual power. Nicholas, still at Mogilev, was slow to grasp what was happening. He decided to return to Petrograd, but revolutionary forces controlled the railway lines. His train was diverted to Pskov, where he found himself at the headquarters of the Northern Front. There, generals began arriving to inform him of the situation. Army after army was reporting that their soldiers were unreliable. If Nicholas attempted to march on Petrograd to suppress the revolution, the soldiers might not follow orders or might join the revolution themselves. The dynasty's last defense, the army, was no longer loyal. On March 1st, delegates from the Duma arrived in Pskov. They told Nicholas that the only way to save the monarchy was for him to abdicate in favor of his son Alexei, with Nicholas, his brother, Michael, serving as regent. Nicholas spent a long, agonizing night considering this decision. He paced his train car, prayed, and consulted with his doctors about Alexei's hemophilia. Finally, on March 2nd, he made his decision. Nicholas agreed to abdicate, but not in favor of Alexei. He could not bear to be separated from his sick son, and he knew that Alexei's hemophilia would make him vulnerable if the imperial family was no longer protected by the throne. Instead, Nicholas abdicated for both himself and Alexei, naming his brother Michael as his successor. It was a decision made out of love for his son, but it was constitutionally questionable and politically disastrous. Nicholas had no right to alter the succession for Alexei. The abdication document was brief and dignified. Nicholas expressed his love for Russia and his hope that his brother would lead the country to victory in the war. He asked all Russians to serve the new emperor faithfully. Then he signed away 300 years of Romanov rule. A junior officer who witnessed the signing later recalled that Nicholas seemed remarkably calm, almost relieved, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. But the drama was not over. When Michael was informed of his new position, he faced an impossible situation. The Petrograd Soviet and the revolutionary workers would not accept another Romanov Tsar. If Michael accepted the throne, he would face immediate revolt. After consulting with Duma leaders, Michael declined to accept the crown unless it was offered to him by a constituent assembly elected by the people. This conditional refusal effectively ended the monarchy. For the first time in 3 centuries, Russia had no Tsar. The February Revolution had succeeded with remarkable speed and relatively little bloodshed compared to what was to come. In less than a week, one of the world's great empires had transformed from an autocracy to a republic. The Romanovs, who had survived wars, peasant revolts, palace coups, and assassination attempts, had fallen almost without resistance. When the moment came, the dynasty that seemed so powerful simply collapsed, revealing that it had been held together more by habit and inertia than by any genuine support or loyalty.
Nicholas returned to Tsarskoye Selo on March 8, 1917. No longer emperor, but simply Nicholas Romanov, a private citizen and now a prisoner. The palace where he had lived with his family, where his children had grown up, had become a prison under guard by revolutionary soldiers. Alexandra and the children greeted him with relief. They had feared during the chaotic days of the revolution that they might never see him again. But the reunion was bittersweet. The family was together, but their world had collapsed around them. The provisional government, led initially by Prince Georgy Lvov and later by Alexander Kerensky, had to decide what to do with the former imperial family. Various options were discussed. Some favored putting Nicholas on trial for crimes against the people. Others suggested exile to England, where King George V was Nicholas's cousin and bore a striking physical resemblance to him. Yet others proposed internal exile somewhere in Russia. In the chaos of revolutionary Petrograd, no firm decision was made, so the family remained at Tsarskoye Selo under what was effectively house arrest. The conditions of their captivity were not initially harsh. The family lived in the Alexandra Palace, a relatively modest residence by imperial standards, with about 50 rooms. They were allowed to keep servants, though many of the longtime staff had fled during the revolution. The children's tutors remained with them. Nicholas was allowed to walk in the palace gardens under guard. The family could dine together and spend their evenings as they had before, reading, doing needlework, and playing cards. But the indignities were numerous and constantly reminded them of their changed circumstances. The palace was surrounded by armed guards, soldiers from the revolution who felt no loyalty to the former czar, and who sometimes treated their prisoners with deliberate rudeness. Nicholas and Alexandra had to obtain permission to move from one part of the palace to another. Their correspondence was censored. Visitors required special approval. The soldiers would sometimes make crude jokes or comments within earshot of the family, particularly about Alexandra, whom many still suspected of pro-German sympathies. Nicholas adjusted to captivity with remarkable stoicism. He chopped wood for exercise, cleared snow from the paths, and maintained a disciplined daily routine. He read extensively, particularly historical works and English novels. He led religious services for the family. In his diary, he recorded the weather, his activities, and small family events, but rarely expressed emotion or complaint. It was as if by maintaining routine and discipline, he could preserve some sense of normalcy and dignity in circumstances that had stripped away everything else. Alexandra found captivity much harder. She had never been physically robust, and the stress of the revolution and captivity worsened her health. She suffered from an undiagnosed heart condition that caused severe pain and shortness of breath. She spent many days in a wheelchair, unable to walk. But even more than the physical suffering, she was tormented by the collapse of everything she had believed in. She had been convinced that the Russian people loved their czar, that the autocracy was ordained by God, that all the opposition came from a small group of revolutionaries who did not represent the true Russian soul. The revolution had shattered these beliefs. The children adapted to captivity with the resilience of youth. The 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, occupied themselves with reading, painting, and caring for their sick mother. They put on amateur theatrical performances and maintained their studies with tutors. Alexei, who was 12 when the revolution occurred, missed the relative freedom he had enjoyed before. His hemophilia meant that he had always been closely watched and restricted, but captivity added a new level of confinement that frustrated him. Still, he remained close to his father and found comfort in their companionship. The family's situation grew more precarious as 1917 progressed. The provisional government was struggling to maintain order and prosecute the war. The Petrograd Soviet, representing the workers and soldiers, wielded real power and was moving steadily leftward politically.
The Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, who had returned from exile in April, was gaining strength by calling for immediate peace, land redistribution to peasants, and transfer of power to the Soviets. In this atmosphere of political radicalization, the former imperial family became increasingly vulnerable. In July 1917, there were violent demonstrations in Petrograd against the provisional government. Some of the demonstrating soldiers talked about going to Tsarskoye Selo to deal with Nicholas and Alexandra. The provisional government, fearing that the former Tsar and his family might be lynched by revolutionary crowds, decided to move them to somewhere safer and more remote. Alexander Kerensky, who had become Minister of Justice and was emerging as the provisional government's leader, took personal responsibility for the decision. The destination chosen was Tobolsk, a remote town in western Siberia on the Irtysh River. Tobolsk was far from the revolutionary ferment of Petrograd and Moscow. It was accessible by river in summer, but largely isolated during the long Siberian winter. The town had no revolutionary tradition and was expected to be less hostile to the imperial family than Western Russia. On August 14th, the family was informed they were leaving. They were given time to pack and to select servants and attendants who would accompany them. The journey to Tobolsk took several days by train and then by river steamer. The family traveled in relative comfort with their own railway cars and adequate food. Nicholas noted in his diary that the journey was pleasant and that they enjoyed watching the Siberian landscape pass by. It was almost possible to forget, temporarily, that they were prisoners being taken into exile. The people they encountered along the way were curious and sometimes sympathetic. There was no hostility, no revolutionary fervor. In the remote provinces, the revolution seemed distant, almost unreal. They arrived in Tobolsk on August 19th and were installed in the former governor's mansion, a large white building that would be their home for the next 8 months. The house was comfortable enough, though smaller than the Alexander Palace, and requiring that the family and servants live in closer quarters. The town itself was sleepy and traditional. Tobolsk had once been an important administrative center in Siberia, but it had been bypassed by the Trans-Siberian Railway and had fallen into obscurity. Its population of about 20,000 was a mix of Russian settlers, exiled criminals who had served their terms, and indigenous Siberian peoples. In Tobolsk, the family's life took on a quiet, almost peaceful quality that would later seem surreal given what was coming. They were guarded by soldiers, but these soldiers were generally respectful and sometimes sympathetic. The family established a routine of religious services, lessons for the children, walks in the yard, and evening activities. Nicholas continued to chop wood and do manual labor for exercise. Alexandra spent much time in prayer and reading religious texts. The children put on amateur theatrical performances and celebrated birthdays. The local population was curious about the former imperial family, but not hostile. Townspeople would gather outside the fence to catch glimpses of them. Some brought gifts of food or flowers. A few of the guards became quite friendly with the family, and some would later risk their lives trying to help them escape. In this remote corner of Siberia, far from the revolutionary chaos engulfing Western Russia, it was almost possible to forget the catastrophe that had befallen them. But in Petrograd and Moscow, the revolution was radicalizing. In November 1917, using the old Russian calendar, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, seized power from the provisional government in what they called the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks immediately began consolidating their power, suppressing opposition parties, and transforming Russia into the world's first socialist state. They signed a peace treaty with Germany, taking Russia out of World War I, but at the cost of vast territorial losses. They began redistributing land to peasants and nationalizing industry. For the imperial family in distant Tobolsk, the Bolsheviks' takeover.
By the spring of 1918, the Romanovs were no longer a royal family, but a burden of immense symbolic weight. The empire they had ruled for 3 centuries was gone, replaced by something colder, more ruthless, and far less forgiving. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children had become prisoners of history, shuttled from one uncertain refuge to another under the watchful eyes of men who no longer bowed when they entered the room. After the abdication in March 1917, Nicholas and his family had first been confined in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the same place where their children once played in bright rooms filled with sunlight and laughter. But now the corridors echoed with the sound of boots, the guards' laughter, the creak of locked doors. Gone were the uniforms and jewels. The Tsar now wore a soldier's tunic, and Alexandra, pale and fragile, spent her days in quiet prayer. They were treated politely, but it was the politeness one extends to the condemned. In August, the provisional government transferred the family to Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town on the banks of the Irtysh River. The journey took weeks. They traveled not as rulers, but as exiles, their train passing through small stations where curious crowds gathered to glimpse the fallen monarch. Some crossed themselves as the train passed, whispering prayers for their safety. Others spat on the ground. The royal train, once a moving palace of mahogany and velvet, now carried only sorrow. Tobolsk, with its pastel churches and wooden houses, was peaceful compared to the chaos gripping the rest of Russia. There, in a governor's mansion turned prison, the family lived through a long and bitter winter. Nicholas chopped wood. The children tutored each other in French and mathematics. The Empress, increasingly ill, wrote in her diary about her faith and her hope that God's will shall be done. They were isolated but intact, still clinging to a quiet domestic routine. Dinners together, family prayers, long walks under guard through the snow. But as the civil war deepened and the Bolsheviks grew stronger, Siberia no longer seemed safe. The anti-Bolshevik White Army was advancing, and the local authorities feared that the Romanovs might be captured and used as a rallying symbol by their enemies. The Bolsheviks in Moscow ordered the family moved deeper into Red-held territory, to the industrial city of Ekaterinburg, on the edge of the Ural Mountains. In April 1918, the transfer began. It was done in secrecy and haste. Alexandra, too weak to travel, was placed in a carriage beside her daughters. Nicholas sat opposite, silent, staring out the window as the endless birch forests passed by. The youngest son, Alexei, was gravely ill with another attack of hemophilia and had to be carried much of the way. The family's few remaining loyal attendants accompanied them: the doctor, the cook, the valet, all sharing the same uncertain fate. At every stop, the guards grew rougher, their discipline cruder. Gone were the polite soldiers of Tsarskoye Selo. In their place were young revolutionaries who saw in the former Tsar a symbol of everything they hated. They no longer used his title. Citizen Romanov, they called him now. And though Nicholas bore it with quiet dignity, each word chipped away at what little illusion of normalcy remained. When the train finally reached Ekaterinburg, the family was taken to a 2-story merchant's house on the edge of town, the Ipatiev house. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Pale yellow walls, a small garden, lace curtains in the windows. But the locals had already given it a grim nickname: the House of Special Purpose. Inside, the rooms were stripped bare. The windows were painted over with whitewash to prevent anyone from looking in or out. The upper floor was assigned to the family, the lower to the guards. The new commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, was not cruel in the ordinary sense, just efficient, unsmiling, and completely loyal to his cause. Life in the Ipatiev house settled into a dull rhythm. The family was allowed to keep their small dog, Joy, and a few personal items. They took their meals together under watch, read the Bible aloud, and marked the passing days in their diaries. But food was scarce, and the guards often mocked them. Alexandra's health continued to decline, and Nicholas, though outwardly calm, aged rapidly. His beard had turned gray, his posture stooped. Outside the walls, Ekaterinburg seethed with revolutionary fervor. Red banners hung from factories. Propaganda posters plastered every corner declaring the death of kings and the dawn of the proletariat. The Romanovs could hear the sound of parades and gunfire in the distance. The civil war was tightening its grip, and rumors spread that the Whites were advancing toward the city. Inside the Ipatiev house, that news offered a flicker of desperate hope, that perhaps at the last moment they might be rescued. But to their captors, that hope was precisely the danger. Moscow sent orders that left no room for ambiguity. The Romanovs were not to fall into enemy hands. As spring turned to summer, the guards became more secretive, their tone more curt. The family noticed strange repairs being made in the basement. Walls freshly whitewashed. Extra guards posted at night. The air in the house felt heavy, as though everyone knew what was coming, but no one dared to speak of it. The Ipatiev house stood silent among the birches, its painted windows glowing faintly in the long northern twilight. Inside, a fallen emperor and his family prayed for deliverance, unaware that history had already sealed their fate. Their road through palaces, prisons, and exile had ended here, in this quiet provincial house, where the story of the Romanovs would meet its terrible conclusion.
It was a still and heavy night in Yekaterinburg, the kind of summer night where the air does not move and every sound carries. Inside the Ipatiev house, the Romanov family had long since learned to live by the rhythms of their confinement. Days blurred into one another, prayers, meals, quiet walks in the garden, the sound of boots in the hallway, the turning of keys in the lock. But on this night, July 16, 1918, something in the air was different. The guards whispered more than usual. The commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, paced the corridors with unusual intensity. Nicholas noticed it first. His instincts, dulled by resignation but not gone entirely, told him that something had changed. The guards' faces were harder, their eyes averted. The sound of laughter, the kind that had occasionally echoed from downstairs, was gone. When he went to bid his daughters good night, he paused a moment longer at their door, as though this would be the last time. Upstairs, Alexandra lay awake in the dim lamplight. Her health had been failing for months. The strain of imprisonment, her constant pain, and the worry for her sick son had worn her thin. She prayed quietly, the small icon in her hand glinting in the half-dark. To her, death had long ceased to be an abstraction. She had written once in her diary, "God's will be done, even unto death." Perhaps she had already accepted what was to come. The children slept restlessly. Olga, the oldest, still wrote in her diary until late at night, her entries reduced to simple lines. "We played cards. Weather warm. Everyone tired." Tatiana, the most devout, had been reading the Psalms aloud before bed. Maria had been teasing her younger sister, Anastasia, who had the energy and defiance of youth even now. And Alexei, pale and weak, lay in her mother's room because the pain in his joints had returned. Just after midnight, footsteps echoed in the hall. The sound was sharp, deliberate.
Doors opened, voices murmured. Yurovsky entered their quarters, calm and formal, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the faint light of the lamp. He informed them that disturbances had broken out in the city, and for their safety, they were to be moved to the basement temporarily. Nicholas nodded politely. It was a routine lie, delivered with practice ease. The family dressed quietly. Nicholas helped Alexei into his shirt and boots. The daughters carried pillows and small items, perhaps thinking they would spend the night in another room. Alexandra asked if they could bring their chairs, and Yurovsky agreed. It was a strange request, but he allowed it, perhaps out of pity, perhaps to keep them calm. They were led down the narrow wooden staircase to the basement. The air was cool and damp. The single electric bulb above flickered weakly. The walls were newly whitewashed, the floor uneven. It was a small room, once used for storage. In one corner stood a few wooden chairs. Nicholas entered first, still in his plain soldier's tunic. Alexandra followed, her steps slow. The daughters arranged themselves quietly behind their parents. Alexei was carried in and placed in a chair near the wall. Dr. Bakin, the family physician, stood beside him. 3 of their loyal servants, the cook, the valet, and the maid, were also there, silent and pale. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The family waited in awkward stillness. They could hear faint noises from upstairs, boots, the shifting of rifles. The bulb above buzzed softly. Then Yurovsky returned, now with a small detachment of guards behind him. He looked at the family, then at a piece of paper in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and bureaucratic. Nikolai Alexandrovich, your relatives have tried to rescue you. The Ural Soviet has decided to execute you. There was a moment of perfect silence. The Tsar turned toward his family, then back to Yurovsky. He managed only one word. What? Before a shot rang out. The room exploded into chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed against the low ceiling. The acrid smell of smoke and blood filled the air. The Tsar fell instantly, struck in the chest. Alexandra crossed herself and tried to rise before she too was shot. The daughters, protected by the jewels they had sewn into their corsets, did not die immediately. The bullets ricocheted, striking walls and floor. The guards fired again and again, confused and panicked in the thick smoke. It took 20 minutes. When it was done, the basement was silent, except for the sound of boots shifting on the floorboards and the drip of water from the ceiling. The bodies lay in twisted forms, still and unrecognizable. The youngest, Anastasia and Maria, had to be finished with bayonets. The guards worked mechanically, grim and wordless. Yurovsky gave his orders calmly. The bodies were carried out through the back door into the courtyard under the pale light of the moon. The truck rattled away down the dark road towards the forest outside the city, to a place called Ganina Yama, where old mine shafts dotted the earth like open graves. There, in the stillness before dawn, they stripped the bodies of their clothing and valuables. Anything that might identify them was removed. The jewels sewn into the daughters' garments were pried loose and stuffed into sacks. Then quicklime and acid were poured over the remains. The ground was uneven. The work hurried. The truck got stuck in the mud, forcing the executioners to change plans. Some bodies were buried in one pit. Others moved later to another. The effort to erase them was frantic, clumsy, and in the end, incomplete. By morning, Yekaterinburg was quiet again. The Apachev house stood as it had before. Its windows shuttered, its garden still. A red flag hung limply in the humid air. Inside, the floors had been scrubbed clean, the bullet holes plastered over. The new regime wasted no time erasing evidence. For days, official silence followed. It was only weeks later that Moscow confirmed in vague terms that the former Tsar had been executed. The fate of his family was left deliberately unclear. But news traveled quickly, as it always does when blood is spilled. In villages and cities, rumors spread that the Tsar had been killed, that his daughters had survived, that angels had appeared in the basement. The truth was both simpler and crueler.
The line of Romanov emperors had ended, not on a battlefield or in a palace, but in the cellar lit by a single flickering bulb. In the months that followed, the civil war consumed Russia entirely. The Whites captured Yekaterinburg briefly, but by then the evidence was gone. The Apachev house stood for decades, silent and unmarked, its walls holding secrets that few dared to speak of. Years later, one of the guards who had been there would recall how Nicholas had looked in that final moment. Calm, almost peaceful, as if relieved that his long humiliation was finally over. Alexandra had whispered a prayer. The children had clung to one another. In their last moments, stripped of all titles and power, they had been simply a family, frightened, faithful, and terribly human. The Soviet state would try to erase them, to reduce them to a footnote in a revolution that promised to bury the past. But history has a way of refusing to forget. The remains would be found decades later, identified and reburied with ceremony and candlelight. The church would canonize them as martyrs, not for their deeds as rulers, but for their suffering as victims. And so the story of the Romanovs, which began in golden palaces and ended in a damp cellar, came to rest in memory, not marble. The empire they ruled has vanished. The world that crowned them long turned to dust. But on quiet nights, when one reads their diaries or sees their faces in fading photographs, the distance between the living and the dead seems to narrow. One can almost hear the faint creak of a wooden stair, the soft murmur of a final prayer, and the echo of a bullet in the silence of history.